Tonight we'll have Dr. Katie Van Valen talking to us about nutrition. And if you're from Butler County, you'll remember Doc from our field day out at Wayne Hatcher. She came down and talked about nutrition and dealing with heifers when we kind of had a heifer field day in Butler County back in September. So when Jason and I was kind of cooking this thing up, we thought it'd be great to have a session on nutrition. So with that, Doc, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll kind of give you a 5-minute warning as we're getting close to 10 till.
Sounds good. All right, let me get my screen shared here. All right. So I apologize. Y'all get to listen to my voice. I promise I feel better than I might sound as I go through this. I've been a little under the weather the last week, but we will make it through this presentation tonight. So I'm going to talk about some developing heifer nutrition. But keep in mind that a lot of these same concepts will follow whether we're talking about heifers or cows or even stocker calves. Some of the same things that we're talking about will kind of apply across the board. So regardless of which sector of the beef industry that you find yourself in or how you market your cattle, hopefully you'll be able to take something away from tonight's talk. So when I think about any kind of nutrition program, I first start with kind of thinking about what the job requirements are for that animal, right? So whether I'm talking about some lactating cows or some finishing steers or in this case replacement heifers, what is it that we're actually asking that animal to do? And so in the case of a replacement heifer, she's got to grow, right? She's got to put some weight on, and hopefully we can do that at about 1.5 pounds per day. That's kind of a typical rate of gain for those girls. They need to grow so that they can obtain puberty at the proper time, so that they can get bred on time, so that they'll calve around 2 years old. But, and if you're selling bred heifers, your job kind of stops at that point where we've got them bred, right? And we get them sold. But if you're raising your own heifers, or even if you're purchasing bred heifers, keep in mind that young female's job really isn't done until she's raised that first calf and she gets rebred again. At that point, that's when we can, in my mind, I can kind of take the foot off the gas a little bit with these young females and know that they're probably going to be okay. But that time period between when she's had her first calf and she rebreeds, that period of time is really critical. And we'll talk about that tonight in terms of that kind of being her most demanding period of time from a nutritional standpoint. So if we want to kind of compare that heifer to a mature cow, we got to think about how they use their nutrients, right? So they have a nutrient requirement. All animals have a nutrient requirement, and that'll differ from animal to animal and from stage of production. And so if we think about that replacement heifer, first and foremost, she has a maintenance requirement, right? That is just what it takes to keep her alive and breathing. But of course, she's still growing, so she's also got a growth requirement. At some point, we're going to breed her. So early on, that in that pregnancy, the requirement for that pregnancy is not very high. But as she moves into mid and late gestation, that requirement will increase. And then, like I said, really that critical time for that young female is right after she's had that first calf, because now she's got that requirement for lactation. And so if we compare her to a mature cow, that's kind of where the mature cow, yes, she's got that lactation requirement that's her highest point. But she's not got the growth requirement on top of that. And so that's really where I find kind of the difference is that these young females just have that extra added layer that they're still growing. And so when we kind of put all that together, you and I may have an idea of how we would hope that those animals use the nutrients that we're putting out there for them. But the animal has a hierarchy of how they use those nutrients. So first and foremost, they've got to meet their maintenance requirement. That's the bare minimum to keep them alive, right? Then they're going to prioritize growth. Okay, so if we're talking about cows, we don't really worry about that, right? Because they're done growing. But we're talking about heifers. Now all of a sudden we care about the fact that growth requirement is sort of the second highest requirement that they have. Then it comes, then if there's anything left over, they will maintain a pregnancy. Anything left over can go then to lactation. And the very last thing that they will use nutrients for is the estrus cycle. So being able to rebreed back. And so in a case of our heifers, we're really asking them to do all of those things at the same time. And so that's why, those first calf heifers that don't rebreed are oftentimes the most culled animal on the farm. But at the same time, they are probably the most costly animal to cull on the farm because she hasn't paid for herself yet, right? Regardless of if we're raising our own heifers or we're buying bred heifers in, she's got a break-even point, and that's typically at about 5 years of age. And so if we have to cull her after that first calf because she didn't rebreed, because our nutrition program wasn't where it needed to be, then that's a pretty costly cull in that situation. So just to kind of drive home this point about the timeliness of this nutrition program in terms of setting these cattle up to be successful in the cow herd, I'd like to pull this data together that kind of looks at the time of conception within a breeding season and looks at the subsequent weaning weight for that calf. So we know that cattle that breed earlier in the breeding season, they're gonna wean an older calf, they're gonna wean a heavier calf, they're gonna bring a more expensive calf, and then she's also more likely to get rebred in the next season at an earlier time point, right? And so when we think about setting these heifers up, we really want to make sure that we get them dialed in so that they get off on the right foot, right? And so they get that first calf born on time so that they can be that heifer or that cow that's conceiving in that first 30-day window of a 60-day calving season. Sorry. And so when we also think about meeting these nutrient requirements, at the end of the day, we're trying to get these cattle to maintain an adequate body condition score. So we know that nutrition and reproductive performance are highly correlated to one another. In fact, I think a lot of times we blame reproductive problems on genetics when they're not necessarily very heritable traits. A lot of times reproduction issues are related to some type of management issue, usually nutrition. And so if we look at this is old data, but it repeats time and time again. And here we're looking at mature cows. There's sort of a magic switch, a light switch, if you will, that turns on and off between a body condition score 4 and a body condition score 5 female. And so when they get below a 5, we have drastic decreases in reproductive performance. When we think about heifers, I typically like to keep them in that body condition score 6 range, mostly because of that. I don't want them flirting with that magic line between a 4 and a 5. And if I know that that's where that magic line is for cows, when I think about heifers, again, having that extra nutrient requirement for growth, I want to make sure that they are well above that. And so that I can keep them off of my cull list and keep them in the herd. Because chances are, if it is truly a nutritional issue and she misses that first calf, she could probably come back and maintain in the herd. But as I kind of mentioned, that the break even point for these heifers is at least 5 years of age. If she misses a calf, that break even now goes out to closer to like 10 years of age. And so it takes much longer for that young female to pay for herself if we don't set them up for success. So when we compare, so I've already talked about these heifers having a higher requirement compared to the mature cows. And so I wanted to take their protein and energy requirements and set those up for you all just to kind of see what the difference looks like. So mid-gestation cows or dry cows, they've got the lowest protein and energy requirement of any type of cattle that we feed, right? They are easy to maintain. They're going to be fine out on pasture. Most of our hay stored forages are going to meet their needs. We don't worry too much about them. So we move into late gestation cows. If we've got some that are maybe a touch on the thin side, maybe we've got some really poor quality hay, I might start worrying about them. Lactating cows, that's when we really start thinking about having to feed the cow herd, right? Because now they've moved up to that protein requirement of an 11 and an energy requirement of about 60% TDN. But look at that developing heifer. She's above all that, right? She's at 12.5% crude protein, 65% TDN. So when we think about how we start thinking about how we're going to feed these critters, I pulled just some data from a feed library. So this is Dairy One. I don't care for how they have it because they just have a grass pasture and a grass hay number. But just to be consistent, so the first number that you're looking at there is the average, and then I have sort of the range. And so if you look at grass pasture, in most cases, protein wise, we're probably going to be okay. I say most cases, if we have some really poorly managed pasture, if we have some pasture, drought conditions, things like that, that can certainly impact nutrient quality and forage quantity that's available. Going into grass hay, right? Average is about 11%. I would argue that average of a typical kind of Kentucky grass hay, it's gonna be lower than 11. It's gonna be closer. Most of what I see is much closer to that 9% range. And I see a lot of samples come across my desk that are quite a bit lower than that even. But then you look over on the energy side, and it is pretty difficult to meet the energy requirements of that developing heifer with grass hay alone. Corn silage, kind of the reverse of those numbers. If you look at the protein requirement, there's no way we're going to meet the protein requirement of a developing heifer with corn silage. But we can meet our energy requirement pretty easily. Then you start looking at some of our supplemental feeds. So I have dried distillers grains on here. That's something that they average about 30% crude protein. Corn gluten feed is another popular option. It averages, somewhere in the 25-28% range. Really good options. It's also high in TDN. Soy hulls, 13% on protein. I would argue it maybe a little bit lower than that typically. It's a pretty big range on soy hulls for protein. Energy, soy hulls are kind of interesting. When we actually analyze them for energy, this numbers that are up here is what you might get back, but they actually have a feed value that's higher than that. So they actually feed closer to an 80 or so TDN. So they can actually be a really good energy source in this situation. So if you look at this, you can kind of put all this together and say, okay, at some point during this period of developing a heifer, I'm probably going to have to feed some stored forage. At some point, I'm going to have to make some decisions about some supplemental feed. because the forage alone isn't going to get us where we need to go. And so we really have to kind of look at whether we're needing protein or energy or both, right? And so when we think about forages, and this is predicted average daily gain of yearling steers. So these numbers would be a little bit different for heifers, but the trends are going to be the same, right? And so what I'm trying to show here is that obviously, depending on what our forage source is, that's going to play a big it's going to have a big impact on what our supplement would need to look like, right? And so obviously, so pastures that are 90% fescue, we can hope to get about 1.5 pounds per day, although I would argue you start getting, obviously in the summer, that drops down pretty significantly. And if we've got a high level of endophyte infection, we may be close to that 1 pound per day. Obviously, if we add in some legumes, increase the nutrient quality of our forage base, then we might see some improved average daily gains throughout the year. But again, we still see that summer slump. And so we got to think about that when it comes to feeding these cattle, because the nutrients that they're going to receive from the forage is not going to be consistent. And so we may have to play with our supplementation program a little bit to fill in that gap so that they maintain close to that 1.5 pounds per day average daily gain. So I love this slide. I use this slide a lot when I'm talking about forage nutrition, because it does a really nice job of explaining what we're working with. And so, especially when we're talking about stored forages, right? That stage of maturity, when we harvest it, that's going to have the biggest impact on what our quality looks like. And what we're really working against here is that protein is in the leaves. And so as the forage plant gets more mature, for every mouthful that animal's consuming, they're going to be consuming a lesser proportion of leaves and a greater proportion of stems. And so the stems contain fiber. And unlike you and I, our cattle are actually able to get some energy out of fiber. But there's a portion of that fiber that is unavailable, is undigestible. And as that plant matures, as the stem proportion of the plant increases, fiber increases, and so does that undigestible portion of the fiber. And so that's really what we're up against, is kind of finding the sweet spot to harvest those stored forages so that we have a higher quality stored forage available for those cattle on our operation that have the higher nutrient requirement. So again, developing heifers, lactating cows, right? I want to make sure I have something that's a little bit higher quality for those animals versus maybe our mid or late gestating cows. The other reason that I worry about quality or think about forage quality is this impact that it has on dry matter intake, or how much the animal can actually consume. Because we always talk about nutrient requirements in terms of percentages, right? I've done it tonight. I've said her protein requirement is 12.5% crude protein. But in all actuality, our cattle actually have a nutrient requirement that is in pounds. So they require a certain number of pounds of crude protein, a certain number of pounds of TDN per day. We talk about them in percentages because it's easy to talk about percentages. It's easy to talk about when we analyze our feed, we're getting percentages. So if I'm talking about distillers is 30% protein and her protein requirement is 12.5%, I'm talking in equal units. But keep in mind that they do have a requirement in pounds that they have to meet. So when we talk about it as a percentage, we're really assuming a certain amount of that they're going to be able to consume a certain amount of feed. And what happens when we have really poor quality forage, they just can't eat enough feed. They can't eat enough to meet those nutrient requirements. So now, not only is it a lower concentration of energy and protein, but they're consuming less of it, which means that that gap that we're trying to fill in to meet her nutrient requirement just got a little bit bigger. Whereas if we have average or higher quality, they're able to consume a larger proportion of their body weight. So again, just kind of getting back to why this idea of forage quality matters. So I've talked about kind of filling in the gap, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do when we're putting a ration together for any kind of beef cattle, except for finishing cattle. Any type of beef cattle in a typical cow-calf setting, we're thinking about forages, right? Forages are going to be the base. We are lucky here in Kentucky to have a great forage base most years. And so that's going to be the basis of our program. And then we're just trying to fill in the gap with supplementation when we need to, when the forages fall short of the requirements or whatever our production goals happen to be. So in order to figure out what we actually need to supplement, we've got to get our hay tested. And if you've listened to me talk before, you've probably heard me say something about hay testing. If you've heard any of our forage colleagues speak before, they always talk about it. But it really is important. It's the only way to actually know what the quality of the forage is that we're feeding. And in fact, to drive this point home, I'm actually going to go back a couple slides because I think I set it up better in this table than anything. If you look at this, look at say grass hay as opposed to corn silage, and grass hay is a really broad term, but look at that protein average and then range, right? There's a much wider range for protein and energy in forages than there is in some of our other feedstuffs, and that's really due to not only the species of forage that we're growing, but also most importantly, probably the stage of production. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of a hay test. Whenever we're formulating rations, whether I do it for you or any other nutritionist that you're working with is formulating a ration, it's really an estimate, right? That's all we're doing is we're making a very good estimate at how we think the cattle are going to perform. If we go in there and just throw in some book values for forage, right? So I can go into my ration balancer and it gives me 5 or 6 different book values for cool season grass hay. I can put that in. If you tell me, oh, my hay's not very good, I can go put in one of the poorer quality ones and have that in there. But that's not going to be as good as if I actually get your hay tested. The other reason why I like hay testing is that we're going to have differences across different lots of hay on our operation, right? Some of it's going to be better quality than others. And if I know what each lot analyzed, because I tested all my lots, and a lot of hay would be classified as hay that was cut from the same field, harvested at the same time, and stored in the same manner. So either we stored it all inside, or if I had to put some of it inside, some of it outside, now I'm going to split that into 2 lots. It allows me to be much more strategic in how I feed out that hay, so that I make sure I am getting the best quality hay to those animals with the highest requirement. So when we send out a hay to a lab for analysis, we get back something that might look like this. This is just a standard example one from Dairy One, which is a commercial lab. And we're going to get a lot of information back. Sometimes we get more information back than we than what you may actually need. But they should all have a dry matter value on there and a moisture value. They should have a crude protein number. They should have a neutral detergent fiber or NDF value, and a TDN value. They will have, like I said, they'll have other information on here, but those are kind of my 4 that I tell people to look for, especially this fiber number. There are some labs that will give you a crude fiber value, and that crude fiber value is basically useless. So it does not tell me nearly as much as having the neutral detergent fiber and the acid detergent fiber values. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is, but just note, if you're looking at hay testing, we want to make sure that we don't get crude fiber, and that we get neutral detergent fiber. If they want to give you both, that's fine. Other things to kind of point out when we think about hay testing, there's different methods, right? If you go to a lab and look at getting your hay tested, there's all different kinds of hay tests out there. NIR is near infrared spectrophotography. Sorry, I butchered that, but NIR, it's okay. It's good, is what I call it. What it is they basically take your sample, grind it up, pass it through a black box that has a light on it. Your sample reflects a certain wavelength of light back. The machine uses a bunch of equations and says, well, if the light looked like this, then the protein must be this. So it's all based on equations from known samples. Wet chemistry is actually where they're actually doing the lab analysis for each of these things. They're actually running, they're actually analyzing how much nitrogen is in there to figure out the crude protein. They're actually doing a digestion where they digest it with neutral detergent and an acidic detergent, so on and so forth. So wet chemistry is better. In my opinion, NIR, where I hesitate on NIR is that if you've got something weird, like corn silage, for example, or if you've got like a legume mixture, you need to make sure that when we're sending those samples off, we're being pretty accurate in telling the lab what that sample is, because that will dictate which equations they use. And if they happen to use the wrong equation, you could get some really skewed results. We don't deal with any of that with wet chemistry. Protein results. There's a lot of protein results on this particular test. So crude protein, available protein, ADICP, adjusted crude protein, soluble protein as a percent of crude protein, degradable protein as a percent of crude protein. NDICP, those are all measures of protein. The one that we really want to look at is crude protein, or better yet, if you get available protein, that's even better. All this is they took this ADICP, which is just, it's heat damaged protein. It's protein that's unavailable. And so they took the total protein number, subtracted the unavailable stuff, and gave you available protein. So if I have available protein, I use it. But if I get a test that doesn't have available protein on it, crude protein is just fine. Energy values, I talked about, you'll get a TDN. You may also see this net energy maintenance and net energy gain will be on most of our tests. And if I'm balancing a ration for you, I'm typically using these values. But again, when we think about, most people think about nutrient requirements, we think about that TDN number. So the reason why I said it was important to get this NDF value is NDF tells us a little bit about feed intake. So as NDF increases in the sample, the amount of that hay or forage that our cattle will be able to consume goes down. And so if I'm trying to ration, balance a ration, ultimately I'm doing a bit of predicting on how much feed I think that animal's gonna consume. And so having that NDF value allows us to kind of predict how much hay we think she's going to consume, so that we can more accurately predict how much supplement she needs to consume. So balanced rations are the key to performance with any cattle, right? And so you could ask any nutritionist what nutrient they think is the most important, and we would probably all have an argument for any one of those on the list. Arguably, without water, they will die the quickest. But all of those nutrients are important. They're all required. And so I like to use this example of the broken barrel, right? So if whichever nutrient is most limiting, or first limiting, that's where we give up our performance, right? So if that's a mineral deficiency, or perhaps a protein deficiency, for example, if we feed a bunch of corn, we could feed 100% corn silage, right? She's still probably not going to meet her protein requirement. So even though energy may be up here with corn silage, her protein's going to be down here. And so we are giving up performance in that particular situation. Talking a little bit about protein supplementation and some things to kind of think about. Protein can be limiting when we think about, especially about heifers, when feeding stored forages or poor quality forages. Typically if we've got good quality forages, growing vegetative forages, I'm not as worried about protein. Whole diet needs to average about 12.5% crude protein. And I put that about on there, depending on rate of gain. If we actually need her to gain about 2 pounds a day, then that protein would need to go up. And so when we think about how we meet that 12.5% crude protein, saying if we do need to supplement a little protein, if we think about a 12 to 14% commodity blend, well, that's awfully close to where her total diet needs to be, right? And so keep in mind, this is total diet. So we're assuming that the forage is below that, and we need to come in with a supplement above that, so that it averages out at 12.5%. So if I'm feeding a commodity blend that's 12 or 14%, and I'm really close to that protein requirement where it needs to actually end up, and my forage is really poor, I'm going to have to feed a lot more of that commodity blend to actually meet that protein requirement, compared to if I fed something like dried distillers grains or corn gluten feed, which are 25 to 30% crude protein. And so this is where working with a nutritionist to kind of formulate what the best value is can really be helpful. Because on a price per ton basis, something like dried distillers grains might be more expensive, but in terms of a value, it may be the better value feed. And then we'll also talk about energy, right? So we can supplement energy. Typically, I think about corn and soy hulls when I think about energy, but dried distillers grain and corn gluten feed are also good sources of energy. And so this is a situation where they can provide, some feeds provide both energy and protein. They're a good source of both. And so that's where looking at those feeds when we know we're short on both can be a really good option and be a good value. I use the example of corn all the time. Corn, I could easily meet the energy requirements of most cattle with corn very easily. I can't always meet their protein requirements. In fact, sometimes if I'm pretty short on protein or I have a high protein requirement, I can't safely feed enough corn to meet that protein requirement, because corn's really low in protein. But if I fed something like dried distillers, and maybe it's a mix of dried distillers and soy hulls, or gluten in soy hulls, I'm much more likely to balance that out and meet both energy and protein. Our need for energy supplementation is mainly dependent on what that forage TDN is, right? Right, because we're basing everything off the forage program. And so what is the forage program giving me, and then filling in the gaps. This is a very general rule of thumb, but just to kind of put you in the ballpark and show you that relationship between the forage TDN value and energy supplementation requirements. We would need to supplement about 1% of body weight when our forage TDN is less than 55%. That goes down to about 0.5% of body weight, or about half the supplementation requirement, when that forage is somewhere in that 55 to 65% range. And so again, that forage TDN value really dictates what our supplement needs to look like. Other things to kind of think about from an energy standpoint. I talk about energy as energy, but cattle really get energy from 3 different sources. The first one being starch. So we're going to get that in corn or in corn silage. They can get it from fat. So things like any of our distillery byproducts are usually relatively high in fat. Any kind of oil supplement will have be high in fat. And then there's digestible fiber. And that's how they're able to get their energy from things like forages and soy hulls. Is their ability to utilize and digest that fiber in a way that non-ruminants cannot. So there's some data out there that starch can affect age and body weight at puberty, and you could argue that that getting heifers bred earlier or reaching puberty earlier is a good thing, and in general it is. But I typically try not to feed too much starch to any kind of developing heifer if I can avoid it. And the real reason for that is we can really overfeed. We can overfeed corn silage and actually kind of get them a little too fleshy a little too early. Fat supplementation, you see a lot of supplements labeled as high fat. When we think about fat supplementation, we want to keep it at about less than 5% of the total diet on a dry matter basis. And the reason for this is it interferes with those rumen microbes. And those rumen microbes are the ones that's what's allowing those cattle to digest fiber. And so if we are interrupting that process, think about it this way. That fiber coming from forage is the cheapest energy source we have on the farm. If we interrupt that process because we're overfeeding a fat supplement that we paid more for, we're really kind of working against ourselves a little bit. Other reasons I don't want to get into a situation where I overfeed starch, not to get too into chemistry, but starch and fiber are digested by 2 different species of microbes in the rumen. And those 2 species, they like different environments, right? So one really likes an acidic environment and one likes a less acidic environment. So the starch digesters, which are these guys here that you can see on the kernel of corn, they work better at a lower pH. Whereas the fiber digesters, which are these guys down here that are digesting that piece of forage, they work better at the higher pH. So if we get into a situation where we're feeding a little too much starch, we're actually lowering the rate of fiber digestion, and we can actually decrease fiber in forage intake. So to prevent that decrease in fiber digestion, I typically tell people to limit starch to about 5 to 10% of the diet, or about 0.5% of body weight. Other things that I think about, that kind of these interactions that exist and why we need to have a balanced diet. Protein can actually increase digestion when we're feeding low quality forages. The reason for this is those rumen microbes that are responsible for digesting those forages, they need protein too. They actually have a protein requirement. But keep in mind, any protein once our protein requirements are met, any excess protein actually gets utilized as energy. And typically, protein is our more expensive feed ingredient. So you're really just feeding really expensive energy. Feeds that are high in energy and protein, but low in starch, are kind of the perfect thing to feed in a forage-based ration, because we're not going to have a negative impact on fiber digestion. So that's things like our byproduct feeds, distillers, and gluten. So those are things that I look for in supplementing a diet. And touch a little bit on vitamins and minerals. Heifers really don't have any wild or crazy requirement differences than that of a mature cow. So these are all of the minerals that they require. The ones that are in red are ones that they have a requirement for, but we don't typically supplement. So when I talk about a complete mineral program or a complete mineral supplement, I'm talking about one that's got calcium, magnesium, phosphorus. It'll have sodium that's going to come in with the salt. It's going to probably have some cobalt, copper, some iodine, manganese, selenium, and zinc. At the same time, our mineral program should also probably include our vitamin A and vitamin E. Those are the 2 vitamins that we need to supplement for beef cattle. There are other required vitamins, things like all the B vitamins, vitamin C, vitamin K, that you and I require. We don't have to supplement those to cattle because they're actually produced by the rumen microbes. So that's why when you look at a mineral tag, you'll typically only see the 2 vitamins on there, vitamin A, vitamin E. Sometimes you'll see vitamin D on there. Not a lot of need to supplement vitamin D unless we have cattle raised in total confinement. And that's typically not the case for most of us. Easiest way to supplement mineral is a free choice mineral. And I've learned that here recently that I need to clarify what I mean when I talk about a free choice mineral. So when I say a free choice mineral, I'm talking about a 50-pound bag or so of mineral that you buy from your local feed stores. Place it in a covered feeder. That's going to be a complete mineral. So again, that's going to have that whole list of the minerals that I talked about. And it'll typically be formulated for about 3 to 4 ounces per head per day. One of the biggest complaints I get about minerals a lot of times is people say, man, they're eating me out of house and home when it comes to mineral. Well, keep in mind that a 50-pound bag should last 50 cows about 5 days. And I should change that cow to head, right? If we're in the middle of breeding season, the bull's out there, he may find his way over to the mineral feeder. The calves are going to find their way to the mineral feeder. A big misconception is that calves don't need mineral supplement. They will visit the mineral feeder and they'll eat into that consumption. And so again, when we think about whether or not they're actually eating us out of house and home, we kind of got to think about how long that 50-pound bag should actually last us. I have on here that not all free choice minerals are created equal. We got to look at the mineral tag. And we have the University of Kentucky, we have our IRM mineral recommendations or specs that can be used to have a mineral made for you. A lot of feed dealers also take that spec and produce a mineral. that aligns with that. And that's kind of our general recommendation of a mineral that should fit for most beef cattle in Kentucky. I don't like blocks. The problem with intake with blocks is intake, right? This block, the white one, that's 100% salt. That red one's about 95 to 98% salt. And the problem is salt limits intake. So they cannot consume enough of either of these products to actually meet the mineral requirements that they have. Also, this one only contains salt, right? It doesn't have any of those other minerals that I said we should be supplementing. This one has some of the minerals that I said we should be supplementing. It doesn't have all, and they're in such low amounts that we're not meeting those requirements. Other issues that I see with this commonly is people think, well, I'm just going to put out a salt block just in case. I'm going to put the mineral out there. I'm going to buy a good mineral and put it out there. I'm going to put a salt block out there just in case. The problem is that mineral that we bought already has salt in it. So if we have extra salt out there, we're really just limiting intake of the mineral that we put out there. And so we don't want to get into a situation where we might end up with something like a selenium deficiency, which is relatively common here in Kentucky. And selenium, like many other minerals, manganese, zinc, copper, they're all important for reproductive performance and growth. So think about the things that we're asking that heifer to do. Those trace minerals are really important for that. Things like phosphorus is another mineral that would be important in reproduction and overall health. So just say no to blocks. I don't care what color they are. I don't care if it's the all natural pink Himalayan salt block that they supposedly will make your deer on your farm grow bigger antlers. I don't care. It's not meeting the mineral requirements for your cattle. Other mineral programs that aren't gonna get you where you need to go is this idea of free choice. Free choice does not mean cafeteria style. This is a method where we offer individual minerals in each of these boxes. This does not work. Cattle lack nutritional wisdom. So like you and I, we can go to the grocery store and we know what's healthy we can know what's healthy for us and what's unhealthy for us. Whether we make healthy choices all the time or not, it's debatable, but we know the difference, right? I know that I could have a salad, or I could go get a big juicy hamburger and know which one of those is better for me, even though I may go with the juicy hamburger. Cattle don't have that same wisdom to know which one's better. They just know which one tastes better. And so their consumption is driven completely by palatability. And there's a lot of minerals that are not palatable. And so you will end up with differences in intake solely because of palatability issues.
Doc, we're about to the 5-minute warning time.
Perfect. So just some kind of put it all together, some strategies for managing and thinking about how we develop a feeding program for these heifers. We got to start with a timeline, right? If we've got a mature cow size of 1,400 pounds, we want her to be about 60% at that first breed of that target of her mature weight at the first breeding season. So we want her to be about 840 pounds. She's currently 600 pounds, so she needs to gain 240 pounds. This example just uses a June 1st breeding season. I know most of us don't use that, but if the start of our breeding season was June 1st, that puts our feeding period from January 1 to June 1, just to use some even dates. That's where we come up with that 1.5 pounds per day average daily gain. So we got to backtrack from there to kind of figure out what this target average daily gain needs to be. Now, how we get there, there's a couple schools of thought, right? Do we do even gain, where they're gaining about 1.5 pounds per day all the way through? Or do we have delayed gain, where there may be little to no gain initially, and then we have a period of more rapid gain? Or early gain, where we have higher gain early on and then little to no gain later on. And some of that can be dependent on your inputs, environmental factors, depending on when we're talking about spring calves or fall calves, and that sort of thing. There's a couple, there's more than one way to get there. Ultimately, at the end of the day, they end up about at the same place. So timing of that gain has little effect on reproductive performance, but it can allow us to manage those heifers in a way to better suit our environment and our forage base on our operations. So again, just thinking about that, thinking about what works for you in your operation. We do want to avoid having to push them too hard, too fast. If we have a lot of fat, if we're pushing them for 3 pounds a day, average daily gain, it's really easy to get them too fleshy, and we can actually get some fat deposition in the udder that we don't necessarily want to have. So that can lead to some decreased longevity issues and things like that. Intensive versus extensive production systems. Intensive means we make sure every heifer gets bred, regardless of the cost to get there, regardless of the inputs it takes to get there, right? So even that sort of dinky calf that was maybe late born, has struggled all of her life to keep up with the others in the group, we're going to feed her hard and we're going to get her there. Chances are I'm going to get her there. I can eventually get her bred. I've been feeding a balanced ration to achieve a targeted average daily gain. Because that nutrition and repro interaction is so strong. We want to make sure that we are providing what they need, but at the same time, am I masking some issues with that calf because I'm feeding them at all costs? So that's kind of the thought behind this intensive system, kind of some pluses and minuses. The extensive system is really survival of the fittest, right? We're going to make the heifers work in their target environment. Nothing wrong with that on face value, but recognize that the highest plane of nutrition that beef female will require in her entire life is during this development period. And then it's kind of downhill from there, right? She's actually got it a little easier as she goes on in life. And so kind of this idea that we're going to make the heifers fit the system, we may be giving up some good heifers. And so my philosophy really is that there's a happy medium somewhere between this intensive and extensive system. We probably need to use some culling strategies early on if we do have some of those really lightweight, light muscle kind of females that maybe just aren't quite with the rest of the group. Maybe we go ahead and cull them out. We're not going to sell them as replacement females or keep them as replacements in our herd. We can sell them as feeder calves, and we've got another market for them. But at the same time, this idea that they've got to make it by on forage and nothing else, we may be giving up some performance, or maybe giving up some good cattle when we take that kind of extreme approach. So again, there is a happy medium between both of those kind of philosophies. So that's all I've got for you all. I'm going to be happy to answer any questions. I just want to put a quick plug in for the Mid-South Stalker Conference. That'll be on February 21st and 22nd at Western's Expo Center in Bowling Green. So it'd be pretty close for all of you all. We do have 2-day and 1-day registration options, so you can just come for the full day program on the 22nd. Got more information at that website, and you can use that QR code to register if you'd like. This year's program, because feed costs are really high, is really forage based. And so probably this year more than ever, we've got a lot of forage and health. And so it would be applicable for folks, even if you're not in the stalker and backgrounding world. So even if you're developing heifers or a cow-calf producer, there may be some things at that conference that you'd find useful. So the full program is on the website there for you to take a look at. And then I'm done. I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. We sure do appreciate it, Greg. I think you're on mute.
Yep, I was on mute, but now you should be seeing the evaluation QR code or something you can click, and I put the link to the evaluation in the chat as well. I couldn't figure out how to do that last week. But we'll take questions for Doc while we're on here, but please go ahead and start doing your evaluation.
Let's see here.
I see, Jason, you answered that one about the hay probe, and I don't really have a specific brand of hay probe that I prefer. I prefer one that I can attach to a drill, so I'm not having to work as hard. But other than that, I don't really have a specific brand that I prefer over the other.
I don't know that this is a big manufacturer. I had to look on my phone and try to find who it was, but it's Hart Machine Company and it's out of Oregon. HART. And that's
I've heard of them.
yeah,
So
it does a good job. But I think there's several others. There's different styles. So I think different people like different ones.
Yep. Like I said, I like the one that I can attach to a drill. It just makes it a little bit easier. Also there's different lengths that can kind of play a role. If you're gonna be doing silage as well as dry hay, for silage I like to go a little bit longer. There's also some, like, you can actually find them on Amazon. Most of our extension offices have them, but some of them have replacement tips, and I like that just for longevity, because eventually that tip will dull down, or if you drop it and you chip the tip, it won't work as easily for you.
Questions for Dr. Van Valen? And as we're waiting on a question, I'll just comment. Most of the forage samples that I send off, we send to the Kentucky Department of Ag, and I think that's all NIR, right?
Yes. Yep. So the KDA lab is all NIR. And again, they're one, if I'm just sending in dry hay samples, grass hay, I'm not too worried about it. If I start sending in something that's a mixture of something, cover crop sample, things like that, things that get weird, I get a little more leery, just because, again, that equation plays such a big role. But if it's a typical grass hay sample, NIR is fine. And NIR continues to get better. It's improved.
I don't think they'll do wet chemistry though, will they?
They don't have that capability at all.
And we usually send our stuff to Dairy One is where we've been sending our wet chemistry.
Yep. That's who I typically use as well. There's Dairy One, Dairyland. There's a Rock River, I think. There's several. I always just tell people, if you're sending it on your own, or I tell our agents when they're sending it, just double check the prices. I know there's a couple labs out there that are atrociously expensive. Dr. Limcooler actually found that out the hard way. He sent some samples out and got a bill that was several $100s more expensive than it should have been. So just double check pricing, because they're all probably about the same. So
all right, we have about 1 more minute. So if you have a question, unmute your microphone. Please fill out your evaluation for us. Jason, I think our last session is next week at 6 o'clock.
It is. That's February the 7th. And Dr. Les Anderson will be doing the program on reproductive management in beef cattle.
So, all right.
Same time, same place.
Yep. And I will send you a reminder link in your email day of, like I did today. Doc, thank you so much. You did a fantastic job and we appreciate you. And this is a great example of one that we would have had to cancel if we weren't doing it on Zoom.
That's
That's
right.
right. All right.
And we hope you feel better and
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
appreciate you.
Yeah,
And
we would have
Feb-
had to probably cancel for multiple reasons. So thank you all for joining.
And February the 7th is a week from today. So next Tuesday night.
Thank y'all.